She was running when she found the door. Not walking fast, running, rain in her mouth, a man's footsteps closing behind her. A folder of paperwork she was never supposed to have pressed flat against her ribs. The door was unlocked. She went through it because there was nowhere else, and she locked it behind her, and only then did she understand she was not alone in that room. He was on the floor, drugged, barely holding his own head up. He never asked her name. She never asked his. By morning, she was gone, and something of his father's was missing, and he wanted her found. If you like stories where the woman doesn't wait to be rescued, where she wins with her own hands, her own mind, and her own record of the truth, subscribe to the channel now and stay with me all the way to the end. And do me one favor, drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Adeline Kovac had learned by the age of 27 that the safest thing a poor woman could own was a written record. Not money. Money left. Not friends. Friends forgot or got tired or moved to a better neighborhood and stopped answering. Not even her own memory, because she had watched grown men in suits look her in the eye and tell a room full of people that she had said something she had never said, and she had watched the room believe them because they wore the suits and she wore a lanyard. So she wrote things down. Every day, in a cheap composition notebook she called her daybook in handwriting, so small it looked like a stitch line. What time she clocked in, what time she clocked out, which forms crossed her desk, which supervisor initialed what, who stood where. She had done it for 6 years at the customs brokerage on the Fox Point waterfront, and people had laughed at her for it, and one man had called her a little machine, and she had smiled and kept writing. They had fired her anyway. They had taken her license anyway. But she kept writing because it was the only thing that had ever belonged to her. That was why on the night everything began, she was still on the terminal grounds 40 minutes after the last shift bus pulled out. She had gone back for a folder. Not stolen, she would have argued that point until her throat gave out, but copied from files she had legally handled before the day they walked her out of the building. 3 entry summaries. 3 declared values that did not match 3 commercial invoices. The same container seal number appearing twice on paperwork that could not possibly describe the same container. She had noticed it 11 months ago. She had raised it once quietly to her manager. 9 days later, she had been accused of falsifying a set of documents she had never touched, and by the end of that month, her name was in a database that made her unemployable in the only trade she knew. She had spent 11 months telling herself she had imagined it. Then that afternoon, she had seen Wendell Pike's signature on a fresh declaration through the window of the brokerage door, and something inside her had said no in a voice she did not recognize as her own. She was halfway down the service road with the copies inside her jacket when she heard the second set of footsteps. She did not turn around. That was the first thing that saved her, the instinct worn smooth by years of being watched by men not to turn around and give them her face. She kept her pace. She adjusted her grip on the folder. She counted her own breaths the way she counted entries on a manifest, and she listened, and the footsteps behind her did not fade. They matched her. When she went faster, they went faster. When she slowed at the corner to test it, they slowed too. And a voice called out across the wet asphalt, calm and almost bored, the voice of a man who did not think he was doing anything unusual. Kovac, don't make this a long night. He knew her name. That was the moment and the world tilted. Not the footsteps, the name. Because a mugger did not know her name. A drunk did not know her name. Only someone who had been told her name knew her name. And that meant someone had said it out loud in a room to a man whose job was to find her. She ran. She ran badly in bad shoes with a folder that kept sliding sideways. And she ran with the specific terror of a woman who has done the math and knows there is no one to call. Her sister was 12 years old and asleep with an oxygen monitor clipped to her finger. Her mother was 4 years dead. Her landlord had already threatened her twice. If Adeline Kovac disappeared on a service road in the rain, there would be one person who noticed, and that person weighed 68 pounds and could not climb a flight of stairs without stopping. She ran 3 blocks and lost the sidewalk and found a hotel that was not a hotel for people like her, and she went up the side stairwell because the lobby had a man in it, and on the 4th floor she tried a door handle out of pure animal desperation. It turned. She went in and she shut it, and she pressed her whole body against the wood, and she twisted the deadbolt, and she stood there shaking so hard her teeth clicked, and it took her a full 4 seconds to hear the breathing. I was on the floor by the bed. not lying half-propped, one shoulder against the frame, the way a man sits when he has tried to stand and failed. His shirt was open at the collar. His hands were open, which she noticed because she had spent her life reading men's hands, not fists, open. And his eyes, when they found her, were not the eyes of a man who was drunk. She had cleaned up after drunks. Drunks were loose. This man was fighting something. His jaw was locked. His pupils were enormous. Every few seconds, his head dropped, and he hauled it back up like a man refusing to drown in shallow water. She should have run. She knew later that she should have run. She did not because she recognized the look. She had seen it once before on her mother in a hospital corridor, the year the tumor got into her spine, the look of a person losing control of their own body and being furious about it. He looked at her. He tried to speak. It came out wrong the first time, and he stopped and started again and got it out in a voice like gravel dragged over concrete. "Lock it. Whoever you are, lock the door." She had already locked it. She told him so. She heard herself say it, and her voice sounded like a stranger's, thin and high, and he closed his eyes and let his head go back against the bed frame. And something in his shoulders released about a quarter of an inch, and that was the whole of it. That was the entire negotiation between them. Two people who had both been hunted that night, agreeing without agreeing that the door should stay shut. She did not know his name. She would think about that later. How she had spent hours in a room with him and never asked, and how in her world that was not strange at all. Nobody asked the cleaner's name either. She had been invisible so long that she had stopped believing names were something people exchanged. She stayed because she was terrified of the hallway. He stayed because he could not stand up. Somewhere in the middle of the night, the rain got louder, and her hands stopped shaking, and the folder of paperwork slid out of her jacket onto the carpet. And she picked it up and held it against her chest like a child holding a stuffed animal. Somewhere in the middle of the night, he stopped fighting to stay upright, and she helped him. She would remember the weight of him, the awful, helpless weight. And somewhere after that, the two of them were not two strangers in a room anymore. And neither of them was thinking, and neither of them said a single word that either of them would be able to repeat afterward. It was not romantic. She would never let anyone call it romantic. It was two people who had been running from separate men in the same storm on the same night, reaching for the only warm thing in the room. She woke before the light did. The first thing she felt was not shame. That came second. The first thing she felt was the flat professional panic of a woman calculating how long it would take to get to work, and then the calculation collapsed because she did not have work anymore. And then the shame arrived all at once, like a bucket of cold water, and she sat up so fast her vision went white at the edges. I was asleep, deeply badly, the sleep of someone who had been poisoned and had come out the other side. His breathing was even. He did not stir. She got dressed with her back to him, and her hands were shaking again, and she had to try 3 times to fasten the buttons on her coat. And then she did something she would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. She stopped in the middle of the room and she looked at the nightstand. There was a watch on it, there was a money clip, there was a phone in a case that cost more than her monthly rent. There was folded over the arm of a chair, a coat with a lining she could tell from 4 feet away was silk. She was 27 years old. Her sister needed a heart valve replaced. The hospital had used the word deposit the way other people use the word goodbye. She had $11 and some change in her account, and she had just lost her last chance at a legitimate paycheck. And there was a man asleep in front of her who would not miss what she took and might not even remember she had been there. She stood there for 11 seconds. She counted them afterward, 11. Then she stepped back from the nightstand, deliberately, physically, the way you step back from an edge, and she said out loud to nobody in a room where nobody was awake to hear it, "I'm not going to touch anything of yours." And she left. She let herself out and she went down the side stairwell because she had come up that way and she did not want to be seen, and she walked out into a morning that was gray and running with water. And she walked 11 blocks because she could not afford a cab, and by the time she reached her building, her shoes had given up entirely. But before she went upstairs, before she opened her own door, before she put her face back together for her sister, she sat down on the 3rd step of her own stairwell, took the daybook out of her bag and wrote it down. All of it. Not the part that shamed her. She never wrote that. But everything else, the time she left the terminal, the service road, the voice that had used her name, the direction she'd run, the hotel, The floor, the door number, the color of the carpet, the fact that a man had been on the floor of that room drugged at approximately 11:40 p.m., the time she had left. What she had taken with her, which was nothing. She wrote it because that was what she did. Because 11 months earlier, a room full of men had decided she was a liar and she had had nothing to prove otherwise, and she had promised herself in the parking lot of that building with a cardboard box in her arms and her hands shaking so hard she dropped her own keys that it would never happen to her again. She had no idea she had just written the document that would eventually save her life. She closed the notebook, put it away, wiped her face with the back of her wrist, and went upstairs to be somebody's whole world. Josie Kovich was 12 and looked 9, and she was awake because she was always awake when Adeline was out. She was on the couch with a blanket up to her chin, and her lips had that color in them that Adeline had learned to check for before she checked for anything else, that faint blue at the center like a bruise that hadn't finished forming. The monitor clipped to her finger showed a number that Adeline read across the room in one glance because she read numbers for a living, or she used to. "You were out all night," Josie said. "You never stay out all night." "The rain got bad." "Your hands are shaking." Adeline looked down at her own hands as if they belonged to somebody else. They were in fact shaking. "I'm cold," she said. "That's all. Did you take the 8 o'clock one?" "I took it at 9. I fell asleep." Adeline knelt down and pressed the back of her fingers to her sister's forehead, the gesture she had done every day for 4 years since the night their mother stopped breathing, and the whole architecture of Adeline's life reorganized itself around one small ribcage. And she thought with a clarity that frightened her, "If someone had gotten to me last night, you would have woken up alone in this apartment and nobody would have come." She did not say that. She said, "You're going to take it at 8 tonight." And Josie said, "Okay," and smiled at her, and Adeline had to turn her face toward the kitchen so her sister would not see it break. Emil Castellan woke at 6:15 in the morning with a headache like a nail through the base of his skull and no memory of the last 9 hours. He lay still and inventoried himself, because that was what he had been taught to do at 19 by men who did not survive to see 40. Hands working, legs heavy but obedient, vision doubled at the edges clearing, wallet present, watch present, phone present, screen down exactly where he would have left it, nothing taken. That was the first thing that made no sense. He sat up and the room swung, and he waited for it to stop, and he pieced together what he could. A meeting at the terminal office. A glass poured for him by a man he had done business with for 6 years. The specific, unmistakable moment, he remembered this part with perfect clarity, and it made him want to break something the moment 40 minutes later, when he had understood what had been in the glass, and had understood that he was already too far into it to walk out on his own feet. He remembered getting to the hotel. He remembered the door, and he remembered in fragments that would not hold still a woman, soaked to the skin, standing with her back against the door like she was holding it shut with her spine, holding something against her chest with both arms. Eyes enormous, not looking at him the way people looked at him. That was the detail that stayed. In 38 years, Emil Castellan had been looked at with fear, with calculation, with appetite, with hatred. He had not in 20 years been looked at by someone who did not know who he was. He put his hand to his throat out of habit and went cold. It was gone. Not a chain, not jewelry. A brass longshoreman's tag worn smooth and almost illegible, stamped with a 5-digit number issued in 1961 to a 19-year-old Croatian kid who had unloaded banana boats at Fox Point for 11 cents a ton and had gone on to own the pier he swept. His father's tag, the one his father had worn every day of his life and had put into Emil's hand in a hospital room with a grip like a vice, and had made him swear on it, Emil. Not on God on this, that he would never forget what the family had been before it was anything. It was the only object in Emil Castellan's life with no market value and no substitute. He was on his feet before he could think. He went through the room like a man tearing open a wound. Under the bed, behind the nightstand, into the sheets, the pillowcases, the seams of the chair. He pulled the drawers out and turned them over. He went through the pockets of his own coat twice. Nothing. And the whole time the woman's face kept surfacing in the fog like something rising in water. He called Teddy Vance at 6:40, 2 rings. "Come to the hotel." Teddy was there in 19 minutes, and he took one look at Emil Castellan, standing in the middle of a destroyed room in yesterday's shirt, and did not make a joke, which was how Teddy Vance had stayed alive at Emil's side for 11 years. Emil told him. The glass, the meeting, what had been in the drink, and by extension, who had put it there and why. Because a man who was drugged and left in a hotel room and not killed has not been attacked. He has been photographed. He has been set up for something later. Somebody had wanted footage or a witness or a story, and something had interrupted it. And then he told him about the tag. Teddy's face did not change, but he sat down, which he never did. Anything else missing? No. Watch on the table. Cash on the table. Teddy let that sit for a moment. So somebody came in, took the one thing in this room that a pawn shop would give you $9 for, and left everything that's actually worth money. Yes. Emil, that's not a thief, that's a message. And Emil Castellan, who had spent his entire adult life being told what things meant, said nothing because Teddy was right. And because there was something underneath the rage that he could not name yet and did not like. Then he said the thing that would set the next 4 months of both their lives in motion. There was a woman here. Teddy waited. I don't know who she was. I couldn't tell you her face if you put a gun on me. She came in out of the rain, and she was afraid of something in the hallway, and she locked the door. He stopped. His jaw worked. Somebody put their hand on my father's tag. I want to know if it was her. Do you want her found? Teddy said carefully. Or do you want her hurt? Emil looked at him. Found. He said it too fast, and they both heard it, and neither of them said anything about it. Teddy stood up and buttoned his coat. Camera staff in every business inside 4 blocks. If she was on that street last night, somebody saw her. Teddy. Yeah. The man who poured the drink. Emil's voice did not rise. That was the frightening part. Don't touch him yet. I want to know who paid him first. Teddy Vance began looking that same morning, and what he found in the first 72 hours was almost nothing, which told him more than a great deal would have. The hotel's 4th floor camera had been dark for 11 days, a maintenance ticket filed and never actioned, which happened except that it had happened on that floor in that week. The night manager remembered a woman coming through the side stairwell door at around 11:30 and remembered nothing else about her, including whether she was young or old, because, and Teddy wrote this down verbatim, and it stayed with him, she was dressed like staff. That was it. That was the entire description. She was dressed like staff. Teddy Vance had grown up poor in Woonsocket, and he had spent 11 years in a world where being unseen was the most expensive skill money could buy. And it struck him as genuinely obscene that a woman could walk through a building at midnight and register on the human mind as furniture. He kept looking. He canvassed. He left a number at 11 businesses and cash at 3 of them and a promise of more. He got a hit on the 5th day at a bar 4 blocks from the terminal from a bartender who remembered nothing but pointed him toward the night cleaning crews. Because he said those were the only women out on that road at that hour, and half of them walked it because the shift bus left at 11 and their shifts ended at 2. Teddy went out to that road at 2 in the morning to see it for himself. He watched 4 women walk it alone in the dark, in the rain with no bus and no ride and no light for 200 yards. And he stood there and thought any one of them could be lying in a ditch by Thursday and nobody would file anything. He did not know it, but he was standing 80 feet from the exact spot where 4 months later he would fail to save a woman's life and where she would save her own instead. Adeline Kovach stopped sleeping, not entirely and not all at once. It came apart in stages the way things do. The first week she woke at every sound in the hallway. The second week she started taking a different route home from the pharmacy. The third week she caught herself checking the reflection in shop windows for a man behind her, and she stood in the middle of the sidewalk and thought with a kind of dull horror, this is what I am now. She applied for 11 jobs in 9 days. She was refused for 6 of them within an hour, which meant the database. 2 never answered. One told her in the kindest voice she had heard in months that they had already filled the position, and Adeline had thanked her and hung up and sat down on the floor of the apartment because her legs had stopped agreeing to hold her. And the money was going. That was the arithmetic that ate her from the inside. Josie's medication was $410 a month with the assistance program and $1,100 without it, and the assistance program required a verified employer. And Adeline had 31 days before it lapsed. She did the numbers in the daybook. She did them 4 times because she kept hoping she had made an error. She had not made an error. She never made errors. That was the whole tragedy of her life. She was very, very good at a job nobody would let her do. It was Wendell Pike who called her. That was the part she never got over. Not the fear, not the humiliation, not any of the rest of it. It was that the man who had destroyed her called her on a Tuesday afternoon and said her name warmly like an old colleague, like nothing had ever happened. Adeline, it's Wendell. She said nothing for so long that he laughed. I heard you've been having a hard time. I want you to know I never had anything against you personally, that whole business that came down from above me. I want you to understand that. Every muscle in her body wanted to hang up. She did not hang up because Josie's monitor was beeping in the other room, and 31 days was 31 days. And Adeline Kovach had learned that the difference between dignity and starvation was often just a question of how long you could hold your breath. Pike told her there was work, night cleaning, a club downtown, a good one, cash payroll plus a real pay stub if she wanted one for the assistance forms. He'd made a call. He'd put her name in. He said, consider it a favor between old friends. She took it. She hated herself in a specific surgical way for taking it, and she took it, and she wrote in the daybook that night, Wendell Pike called at 2:14 p.m. and offered me a job I did not apply for. She underlined did not apply for twice. She did not know why. It just felt like a thing that should be underlined. The club was called the Verrazzano, and it was on the third floor of a building on Weybosset Street, and Adeline started there on a Thursday. She worked a shift that began after the last guest left. She wiped down brass, she pulled glasses, she vacuumed under banquettes where people had dropped things they would never come back for, earrings, a passport, once a wedding ring. She turned all of it in, every single time, because she had been accused once of taking what was not hers, and she was never ever going to give anyone the chance again. The other cleaners liked her because she was quiet and did not complain and knew how to work a floor buffer. The floor manager did not learn her name for 3 weeks. She did not mind. She had come to understand something about invisibility that most people never had to learn. It was a wound, and it was also a tool, and if you were smart, you could carry it both ways. Because when you are invisible, people talk in front of you. They talked in front of her constantly. Men in $800 coats stood 4 feet from her while she scrubbed a baseboard and said things into their phones that they would not have said in front of a waiter. She learned the rhythm of the place in 11 days. She learned that the fourth floor rooms were not part of the club. She learned that on certain nights the elevator was locked out and the stairwell door on 3 was propped, and that on those nights the staff were sent home 20 minutes early. She wrote none of it down at first. Then she wrote all of it down because that was who she was, and because 11 months of unemployment had taught her that the only thing standing between her and the next false accusation was the density of her own record. On her 19th night, she was doing the brass on the mezzanine rail when the room changed. She felt it before she understood it. The security men at the door stood up straighter. 2 conversations stopped mid-sentence. A bartender who had been leaning on his elbows for an hour was suddenly not leaning on anything. She looked up because everyone looked up. A man was coming down the main stairs. Tall, dark coat, no hurry at all. The specific unhurriedness of a person who has never in his adult life had to wait for a room to make space for him. And Adeline's heart did something so violent and so unexplained that she actually put her hand flat against the rail to steady herself. She did not know him. She was certain she did not know him. She had never seen his face in her life. And yet her body had reacted before her mind had the way a body reacts to a smell from childhood. And she stood there with a polishing cloth in her fist and no idea why she felt like crying. He reached the bottom of the stairs and his eyes moved across the room, the way a man's eyes move when he is counting exits, and they stopped on her. Just for a moment, she saw the exact instant something snagged in him. His head tilted a fraction of an inch. His brows drew in. He stopped walking half a step, no more, so small that nobody else in the room would have registered it. And he looked at her the way a person looks at a word in a language they used to speak. Adeline did what she had trained herself to do her whole life. She lowered her head, stepped back, murmured an apology to no one, and made herself disappear. She turned the corner and she stood in the service corridor with her back against the wall, and she pressed the heels of both hands against her eyes, and she thought, what is wrong with you? She did not know that she had just been looked at by the man from the hotel room. He did not know he had just looked at her. Neither of them would understand it for 4 months, and by then 2 people would have tried to kill her, and one of them would be the woman who had once shared half a bread roll with her when they were 9 years old and hungry. She was still shaking when she got to the staff room at the end of her shift, and Wendell Pike was standing in it. He was not supposed to be there. He had no reason on earth to be in the staff room of a nightclub on Waybosset Street at 3:40 in the morning, and he was leaning against the lockers with his coat over his arm like a man who had been waiting a while and did not mind. "Adeline," he said, "how's the new job?" She said it was fine. "They treating you all right?" She said they were. He nodded and looked at her for a moment too long, and then he said something that stopped her hands where they were. "You know, I always told people you were the best reader of paper I ever had. You'd sit with an entry summary 40 minutes when everybody else was signing off in 4." He smiled. "You always did read too carefully, Adeline. That was the whole problem." She stood absolutely still. Because in 11 months, through a termination hearing, and a license revocation and 4 appeals, she could not afford a lawyer, for no one had ever once said out loud that the problem was that she had read too carefully. They had said she was careless. They had said she was dishonest. They had built an entire file on the premise that she had been sloppy. And here he was at 3:40 in the morning in a room where nobody could hear him telling her the truth. He pushed off the lockers and picked up his coat. "Anyway," he said, "it's good you've got something steady with your sister and all." And he left. Adeline Kovich stood in that staff room for a long time with her heart going like a bird against a window. And then she reached into her bag with hands that would not stop trembling. And she took out the daybook and she wrote down the date, the time, the location, and every word he had said as exactly as she could remember them. Then she sat down on the bench and put both hands flat on her thighs and made herself breathe. Because for 11 months she had believed in the deepest and most shameful part of herself that maybe she really had made a mistake. That maybe she was the person the file said she was. That maybe she was not careful. She was just strange and difficult and a little machine that nobody wanted. And a man had just walked into a room and accidentally told her she had been right. She had been right. The declarations were wrong. The seal numbers were wrong. Somebody was moving something through Fox Point Terminal in paper that did not match what was moving through it in steel. And 11 months ago, she had noticed, and they had taken her life apart for it, and they had not stopped doing it because Wendell Pike's signature had been on a fresh declaration that very afternoon. She looked down at her own hands. She was 6 days pregnant and did not know it yet. She was 4 months from the night a car would come for her on a dark road, and 8 months from the day she would walk into a house on the east side and put a stack of paper on a table in front of the most feared woman in the state of Rhode Island and say, "I can prove all of it." But that night in a staff room that smelled like bleach and cigarette smoke, all she knew was one thing, and she held onto it the way a drowning person holds onto a rope. She wrote it in the daybook, in the small stitched handwriting on the last line of the page. I was not wrong. She found out on a Tuesday in the bathroom of a pharmacy on Broad Street because she could not wait the 11 minutes it would take to get home. She had bought the test with coins, actual coins counted out on the counter, while a teenage cashier waited with the specific patience of someone who has been told not to sigh at customers, and Adeline had felt her face burning the entire time and had made herself keep counting anyway, because she had decided years ago that she would rather be humiliated in public than owe anybody anything in private. 2 lines. She stood there holding it, and her first coherent thought was not, "Oh God," and it was not, "What do I do?" Her first coherent thought, and she would be ashamed of this later and then stop being ashamed of it, was a number. $410 a month for Josie's medication. 31 days until the assistance program lapsed. The hospital's word for what a valve replacement cost, which was not a number at all but a sentence. And the sentence was, "We'll need a deposit before we can schedule." And now this, she put both hands flat against the wall, and she leaned her forehead against the cold tile, and she did not cry because crying was a luxury with a time cost. And she had a bus to catch, and she stayed there for exactly as long as it took to count to 20. Then she straightened up. She washed her hands. She put the test in the trash under a paper towel like she was hiding a body. And on the bus with her bag in her lap, she took out the daybook and wrote the date and the result and the name of the pharmacy, because she wrote everything down, and because some part of her that was smarter than the rest of her already understood that a woman in her position would eventually be asked to prove when she had known. She did not write down the other thing. The thing that had happened in her chest 3 seconds after the two lines appeared before the arithmetic arrived a small, appalling flare of something that was not fear. She was not going to look at that yet. She lasted 6 days before she told somebody. 6 days of doing the numbers, of standing in the kitchen at 4 in the morning, with a calculator, of looking at her sister asleep on the couch with a monitor on her finger and thinking, I cannot do this, I cannot possibly do this, and then thinking with a stubbornness that felt almost like anger, and I am going to do it anyway. On the seventh day, she called Rhea Dolan. They had known each other since they were 7 years old and living 2 doors apart in a building on Manton Avenue that the city eventually condemned. Rhea had been the loud one, and Adeline had been the careful one, and for 20 years that had been a functional arrangement. Rhea had once broken a boy's nose for calling Adeline poor. Rhea had sat with her in the hospital corridor the night their mother died, and had not said one single stupid, comforting thing which Adeline had never forgotten. They met at a diner on Atwell's because it was cheap and open late. Rhea looked expensive now. That was the first thing Adeline noticed, and the first thing she was ashamed of noticing. The coat, the nails, the way she held her phone. Rhea worked the door at a members club on the other side of downtown, and she had spent 5 years turning herself into someone who could stand at that door without being asked what she was doing there. And it had worked, and it had cost her something Adeline could not name. Adeline told her everything. The service road, the man's voice using her name, the hotel, the room, the stranger she had never asked about and had never seen again. The two lines. She told it badly in the wrong order, crying halfway through, and Rhea sat across from her and held her hand on the table and did not once let go. Okay, Rhea said. Okay, breathe. You're not doing this by yourself. Rhea, I can't afford. I know what you can't afford. I've known what you can't afford since we were 9. Rhea squeezed her fingers hard enough to hurt. You listen to me. You have been carrying that kid in that apartment and that whole hospital on your back alone for 4 years, and you never once asked anybody for anything. So you're going to sit there and let somebody help you for one night. Okay. Adeline put her free hand over her eyes and cried properly. Then for the first time since the pharmacy, and Rita moved around to her side of the booth and led her. And because Adeline's face was against her friend's shoulder, she did not see it. She did not see the moment, about 90 seconds later, when something behind Rhea Dolan's eyes went quiet and level and began to work. Because Rhea had heard a story about a rich man in a hotel room on a rainy Tuesday night, and Rhea Dolan had a brass longshoreman's tag sitting in a drawer in her apartment. And Rhea Dolan had watched a man in a beautiful coat come into her club 4 days earlier and hand her boss a phone number and say he was looking for a woman who had been near a certain hotel on a certain night. Adeline cried into her shoulder, and Rhea stroked her hair and said all the right things. And in her head, without any noise at all, 3 separate pieces slid together and locked. The tag had gotten to Rhea by the dumbest possible route, which is how most catastrophes travel. Wendell Pike had found it 11 days earlier in a puddle at the edge of the hotel's service drive on his way back from a meeting he should not have taken. He'd picked it up because he picked everything up. He'd looked at it and seen Brassel worn a number stamped into it, and he'd assumed it was worth something to a collector and put it in his coat pocket and forgotten it for a week. Then a man in Cranston, to whom Wendell Pike owed $19,000, had explained without raising his voice what Thursday was going to look like. And Rhea Dolan, who ran the door at a club where men with money drank and who had spent 5 years lending small amounts at short term because the door job paid $700 a week and she was never going back to Manton Avenue, had covered him. He'd handed her the tag as collateral and said, "That's antique. That's worth real money to the right guy." Rhea had turned it over and seen a 5-digit number and thought, "This is worth $11 and he thinks I'm stupid." She had put it in a drawer. She had not thought about it again for 6 days. Now she sat in her own kitchen at 2 in the morning with it in her palm, and she was not looking at a piece of brass anymore. She was looking at the only physical object on the planet that could put a person in that hotel room on that night. And she knew the story, every detail of it. Adeline had handed it to her across a diner table with both hands weeping, holding nothing back: the rain, the room, the man's condition, the fact that he had never said his name, and she had never said hers. Adeline had given her the whole thing. Rhea sat there for a long time. She was not in that moment or a villain. That was the part nobody would ever understand afterward, least of all Adeline. Rhea Dolan sat in her kitchen and thought about her mother who had died at 51 on a transplant list. She never got to the top of in a hospital that had been very kind and very sorry, and whose grave had a plastic marker on it because a headstone was $900, and Rhea had been 22 and had not had $900. Rhea had learned a thing that year that she had never been able to unlearn. The world was a ledger and it had been written in before she was born, and nobody was coming to correct the entries. You either wrote yourself in or you stayed out. That was what she told herself. That was the sentence she used. She was not stealing from Adeline. She was correcting a ledger. Adeline was never going to end up with a man like that anyway. Girls from Manton Avenue did not end up with men like that. They ended up cleaning for them, so the opportunity was going to be wasted either way. And if it was going to be wasted, why shouldn't Rhea have it? She turned the tag over one more time. Then she picked up her phone and called the number the man in the beautiful coat had left at her club. Teddy Vance had been chasing ghosts for 11 days when a woman called him and said she was the one they were looking for. He set the meeting for a coffee place on Wickenden at 4 in the afternoon. Deliberately public and deliberately unglamorous, and he got there 30 minutes early and sat where he could see the door. She came in looking exactly right. That was the first thing that bothered him, and he could not have explained it to anyone. She came in looking frightened and embarrassed and slightly underdressed. For a woman who worked at a members club, and her eyes were already red, and she sat down and put her hands in her lap and said, "I don't know how to start." Start with that night. She told it well. She told it with hesitations in the right places. She said she hadn't known who he was, that neither of them had been thinking that she'd run out in the morning because she was ashamed. Teddy asked her about the room. She described the smell of it, polished wood and expensive soap. She described the rain against the window. She described the man's condition, the way he had not been drunk, but had been fighting something, the way he had asked her to lock the door. Every word of it was correct. That was the second thing that bothered him. "Why did it take you 11 days, he said. "Because I was scared." Her voice cracked exactly where a voice should crack. "Because I found out who he was afterward, and I thought people like me don't walk into that. I thought if I said anything, I'd disappear." So what changed? And Rhea Dolan opened her bag and put a piece of velvet on the table and unfolded it. Teddy Vance had not been surprised by anything in 6 years. He was surprised then. He felt it move across his own face before he could stop it, and he hated that. And he picked up the brass tag and turned it over and read the number stamped into it and knew with total certainty that he was holding the thing Emil Castellan had torn a hotel room apart looking for. "I took it," Rhea said. "I don't even know why. I was panicking. It was on the floor and I grabbed it, and I've been sick about it every day since." Teddy closed his hand around the tag. Everything she was saying fit, every single thing. And that in the end was the problem. Because in 11 years, Teddy Vance had never once taken a statement from a genuinely frightened person that fit. Frightened people contradicted themselves. Frightened people got the day wrong and then got angry about being corrected. Frightened people gave you the useless details, the color of a chair, a song they couldn't get out of their head, and left out the ones that mattered. This woman had given him a clean, sequential, load-bearing account, and she had given him the physical evidence at the exact moment the account needed reinforcement. It was a good performance. It was too good. It was the difference between a witness and a script. He said none of that. He said, "I'll bring this to him. Somebody will call you." And then Rhea, who had rehearsed this and had been waiting for it, put her hands flat on the table and looked up and said the sentence she had built the whole thing around. "There's something else." She swallowed. "I'm pregnant." Teddy Vance sat very still. "How far?" "Almost 2 months." He looked at her for 4 full seconds. "Ms. Dolan," he said, "you understand what family you just said that to?" "I understand." "No," Teddy said quietly, "I don't think you do." Emil Castellan turned the tag over in his fingers for a long time before he said anything. Teddy had laid the whole thing out, the meeting, the account, the object, the claim, and had done it flat without editorial, the way he always did, and then had stood there and waited. "You don't believe her," Emil said. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to. You said she stated 4 times. You never say she stated." Teddy exhaled. "It's clean, Emil. That's my whole objection. It's the cleanest statement I've taken in a decade." "So it's true. Or it's memorized." Emil set the tag down on the desk and his hand stayed on it, and Teddy watched a man who had ordered other men to do terrible things sit there and look at $9 worth of brass like it was the last piece of his father on earth. The woman in that room, Emil said. She looked at me like she'd never seen me before. Not like she didn't recognize me, like it hadn't occurred to her that I was anybody. Do you understand what I'm telling you? She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of whatever was in the hallway. I understand. That's not the woman you just met. No, Teddy said, it isn't. They sat with that. Watch her, Emil said finally. Don't touch her. Don't scare her. Put someone on her and find out everything where she works, who she owes, who she talks to, and where a woman who works a club door got hold of my father's tag. He looked up. And Teddy, if she's lying about a child, I want to know that before my mother does. Why? Because if my mother hears the word pregnant in this house, Emil said the rest of it stops mattering. I was right, and he was 2 days too late. Rosalind Castellan was 67 years old and had kept the family's book since 1979, and she had learned everything she knew about the world from ledgers that people lied constantly in conversation and rarely on paper, that a business could survive almost anything except a gap in its records, and that blood was the only asset that did not depreciate. She had buried a husband. She had buried a son at 19. She had one child left and no grandchildren. And she was not a sentimental woman about most things and was completely unreasonable about this one. She summoned Emil to the house on the east side and told him, "You'll acknowledge her. I'm not sure it's true. Then find out. But you'll do it fast because you have enemies who count Emil, and right now they can count exactly how many Castellans there are." She set her cup down. "It's one. Teddy thinks she's lying. Teddy thinks everyone is lying. That's what you pay him for." Rosalind's voice sharpened. "You were drugged. Do you know what a drugged man's memory is worth in an argument? Nothing. Less than nothing. So what do we actually have? We have your father's tag, which has not left that chain since 1908, in the hands of a woman who says she was in the room. That is not a feeling, Emil. That is an entry." He said carefully, "There's another possibility, which is that somebody else was in that room and this woman got hold of the tag afterward." Rosalind looked at him for a long moment. She was not stupid. She had considered it, and she had decided against it for a reason she was not proud of and would never say out loud, which was that the alternative meant waiting, and she had been told in March by a doctor she trusted that she should not plan past 2 years. "Bring her in," she said. "Watch her if you like, but bring her in." Adeline started throwing up at work. She hid it well for 11 days, and then she stopped, being able to hide it, and one of the other cleaners, a woman named Fatima, who had 4 kids and no patience for nonsense, caught her on her knees in the third-floor bathroom at 2:40 in the morning and did not ask a single question. She just came back with a plastic cup of ginger ale and a sleeve of crackers from the bar and set them down on the tile and said, "Sit for 10 minutes. I'll do the mezzanine." Adeline said she couldn't. "You can. You'll do mine next week." Fatima crouched down. "How far along?" 11 weeks. "Does the father know?" And Adeline laughed an awful, wet, involuntary sound and said, "I don't know his name." Fatima did not flinch. She had heard worse in that building. She just nodded and said, "Then it's yours. That's not the end of the world. It's just more work," and got up and went to do the mezzanine. It was, Adeline thought afterward, the single kindest thing anybody had said to her in 4 years. She sat on the bathroom floor of a nightclub at 2:40 in the morning, eating crackers out of a sleeve. And she put her hand flat on her stomach for the first time and she said out loud, very quietly, okay, we'll figure it out." Rhea stopped answering her phone. It happened gradually enough that Adeline made excuses for 11 days. Rhea was working. Rhea's phone was broken. Rhea was seeing someone. Then Adeline went to the club on a Thursday because she was frightened and had nowhere else to put it, and the girl at the door said Rhea didn't work there anymore. "Since when?" "Like 2 weeks," the girl shrugged. "She got something better, I guess. Good for her." Adeline stood on the sidewalk with her phone in her hand and felt something she could not identify, which was the first sensation of a floor going out from under a person who does not yet know they are falling. She texted Rhea, "Are you okay? Please just tell me you're okay." Nothing. She texted the next day and the next. Nothing. And on the 6th day, she wrote in the daybook, in the small stitched handwriting, "Rhea has not answered since the 14th, and then she sat and looked at the sentence for a long time. And then she added, because she wrote everything down, and because she had promised herself she would never soften a record to make herself feel better, I told her everything." The thing broke open on a Tuesday, and it broke open in the worst possible place. Adeline was on the mezzanine at 11 at night, which was early. A private function had run long, and the cleaning crew had been called in ahead of closing, and she was working the far rail with her head down when she heard the laugh. She knew that laugh. She had known it since she was 7 years old. She looked up, and Rhea Dolan was standing 30 feet away in a coat that cost more than Adeline made in 4 months, with her hair done and her hand resting very lightly on the sleeve of a tall man in a dark suit. Adeline's whole body went hot with relief. That was the thing she would be most humiliated by afterward, not the rest of it. That her first reaction was relief, that she took a step forward with the cloth still in her hand and started to say her friend's name, because Rhea was alive, Rhea was fine, Rhea was here, and Rhea turned and looked at her. There was one full second in which Adeline saw recognition arrive in her friend's face. She saw it land. She saw Rhea know exactly who she was, and then she watched Rhea decide. "Excuse me." Rhea's voice carried across the mezzanine pitch to reach every person on that floor. "Is there a reason the cleaning staff is on this level during service? Some of us are trying to have a conversation without a bucket in it." The floor manager materialized out of nowhere. Somebody laughed high and nervous. Adeline stood there with a rag in her fist. "I'm serious," Rhea said, and she looked Adeline directly in the eyes while she said it. "You people are supposed to come out after. Nobody wants to look at that while they're drinking. You people." Adeline heard the room stop paying attention. She heard the specific quality of silence that happens when 11 people simultaneously decide that something embarrassing is occurring and that it is not their problem. Her face was burning. Her hands were shaking. And underneath all of it was a confusion so total that it felt like a physical illness. Because none of it made sense, because 6 weeks ago, this woman had held her hand across a diner table and told her she wasn't alone. And Adeline's mind kept trying to reconcile the two things and kept failing, the way a tongue keeps going back to a missing tooth. She could have said it. That was the thing. She could have said, "Rhea, it's me," out loud in front of everyone, and blown a hole in whatever was happening. She did not. She lifted her head and she looked at her oldest friend, and she said, not loudly but clearly enough to reach, "I'm doing my job. I'll be out of your way." And then she turned around and walked off the mezzanine with her back straight, and she did not run, and she did not cry until she got to the service stairs. With us there, Emil Castellan watched the entire thing. He had been standing 4 feet from Rhea Dolan with her hand on his sleeve when it happened, and he had felt her hand tighten before she spoke, and he had turned to see who she was looking at. And he had seen a woman on the mezzanine with a rag in her hand, and something had gone through him like a wire pulled tight. He knew that face. He did not know from where. He had spent 11 weeks reaching for a face in a fog and coming back with nothing. And now there was a woman 30 feet away in a cleaning uniform, and every nerve in his body was insisting on something his memory could not produce. He watched her get humiliated. He watched her take it. He watched her decide in real time not to fight, and he had spent his entire life around people who fought, people who could not let the smallest thing go, and he understood immediately that what he was looking at was not weakness. It was a woman who had done this arithmetic before and knew exactly what fighting cost. And he felt something he had no framework for at all, which was rage on behalf of a stranger. He turned to Rhea. "What was that?" "What?" she laughed. "Emil, she was—" "What was that?" he said again, and something in his voice made two men at the bar find somewhere else to look. Rhea's smile flickered. "I'm sorry. I've had a hard week. I shouldn't have." "You know her." It came out flat. It was not a question. Rhea's hand slid off his sleeve. "No," she said. "Why would I know her?" And Emil Castellan, who had spent 20 years learning to hear the half-beat of hesitation before a lie heard it. He said nothing else. He walked her to a car and put her in it and told her he'd call. Then he stood on the sidewalk in the cold and took out his phone and called Teddy Vance. "The cleaner on the mezzanine tonight," he said. "The one Dolan went after. I want her name, and I want it tonight." "Why, 9 floors of the same building away." Adeline Kovich was sitting in the service stairwell with her forehead on her knees. She had 11 minutes of break left. She spent 4 of them crying, and then she stopped because there was a shift to finish, and because crying did not change the arithmetic, and then she did the only thing she knew how to do with a thing that had hurt her. She took out the daybook and she wrote it down. The date, the time, the location, what Rhea had said word for word, both sentences. Who had been standing there. The fact that Rhea had recognized her and had chosen not to know her. Her handwriting was ruined big and shaking, nothing like her usual stitching, and she looked at the page and thought distantly, someone will look at this someday and know I was crying. She let it stand. Then she went back and finished the mezzanine and the fourth floor rooms, and at 3:20 in the morning she was pulling the cushions on the corner banquette in the private room upstairs when her brush caught on something wedged deep in the seam. She worked it out with 2 fingers. It was a folded sheaf of paper. 6 pages creased hard down the middle, the kind of fold a man makes when he shoves documents into an inside pocket in a hurry. She almost threw it in the bin. She had a bin on the cart. She had turned in earrings and passports and a wedding ring, and every instinct she had built in 11 months of unemployment screamed at her that a woman with her record should not be holding a stranger's paperwork at 3 in the morning. But she was Adeline Kovach, and she had never in her life put a document in a bin without reading what it was. She unfolded it, and she stopped breathing. Because it was an entry summary. It was 3 entry summaries and 3 commercial invoices, and she had read 4,000 of these in 6 years, and she did not need to think about it. Her eyes went where they always went, down the right column to the declared value and then across to the seal number, and then back. The declared values were wrong, not slightly, not roundable. Wrong by a factor that meant somebody was paying duty on about a third of what was actually moving. And the seal number on the second page was the same seal number as the 5th page. The same container seal, 2 different shipments, 2 different dates. It was the exact thing. It was the exact same architecture she had found 11 months ago and had raised her hand about and had been destroyed for. Her hands were shaking so badly that the paper rattled, because it was not the fraud that was making the floor tilt under her. She had already known about the fraud. It was the header. Every single page was filed under the terminal operator of record. Every page, 6 for 6, somebody was not stealing from Fox Point Terminal. Somebody was building a paper trail that made Fox Point Terminal look like the one doing the stealing. And the man who ran Fox Point Terminal was Adeline was fairly sure the man who had been standing on the mezzanine 4 hours ago, watching a woman in a $5,000 coat call her garbage. She heard footsteps in the corridor. She had about 2 seconds, and she used one of them to think and one of them to move. She folded the pages, shoved them flat into the front pocket of her apron, dropped to one knee, and started scrubbing the banquette leg like it had personally offended her. 2 men came in. She did not look up. She kept scrubbing. She heard one of them stop. "Who's she, night crew? Since when do they do this room?" A pause. Adeline's heart was hitting her ribs so hard she was certain they could hear it. "Yoth," the first man said. "How long you been in here?" She lifted her head and made her face into the thing she had made it into 1,000 times: mild, tired, uninteresting. 20 minutes, sir. I'm nearly finished. I can come back." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he made the smallest dismissive motion with his hand, the one people made at furniture, and turned back to the other man and kept talking as though she had ceased to exist. Adeline finished the banquette leg. She stood up. She wheeled her cart out at exactly the pace of a woman with nowhere to be, and she got to the service corridor, and she got to the stairwell, and she made it down 1.5 flights before her legs stopped working, and she had to sit down on the landing. She got the pages out. She read them again under the emergency light. She had been right 11 months ago, and it had cost her her license, her career, her name, and every dollar of the security her sister's life depended on. And now she was holding 6 pages that proved it in a building owned by the man they were being used against, with a child inside her belonging to a stranger, and a best friend who had looked her in the eyes tonight and pretended not to know her. Adeline Kovach sat on that landing and understood 3 things in the space of about 4 seconds. The first was that whoever had lost these pages was going to come looking for them. The second was that she was the only person in Rhode Island who could read them. And the third, the one that made her go very, very still, was that Wendell Pike had put her in this building on purpose. She did not go to Emile Castellan. That was the decision she made on the bench outside the hospital at 1 in the morning, and it took her 4 more days to understand why she had made it. And when she did understand, she wrote it in the daybook in one line: "He is the target. Targets panic. The person who keeps the books does not panic." Because she had worked 6 years in an industry where the man whose name was on the door had never once opened a file, and the woman in the back office had known where every dollar was, Adeline had spent her whole career being that woman. She knew exactly who ran a family business like that one, and it was not the person the newspapers photographed. So she found out who kept the Castellan books. It took her 3 days, and it was not hard because Adeline Kovac knew how to read public filings the way other people read street signs. Property records, corporate registrations, liquor licenses. And there it was on 11 separate documents going back to 1981 in the officer field in the same 3 words every time. Rosalind M. Castellan. She was on 9 of them as treasurer. On 2, she was the registered agent. On one from 1994, she was the only human being listed at all. Adeline sat with that and thought, there you are. She spent 2 days building the file, and she built it the way she would have built it for a customs audit because that was the only way she knew how to build anything. Not a story, a binder. Tab 1 was the 6 pages themselves in a sleeve, untouched with a handwritten note, stating where and when she had found them and that she had made no alteration to them. Tab 2 was her own reconstruction. Every mismatch circled, every declared value, cross-referenced against the commercial invoice, every seal number pulled out and listed. And beneath it, in plain language, one paragraph explaining what the pattern meant because she had learned in 6 years that the most important skill in her trade was not finding the error. It was explaining the error to someone who did not have 4 hours. Tab 3 was her own termination file. 11 months of it, the internal query she had submitted on a Tuesday. The complaint filed against her 9 days later. 4 appeals, 4 denials. Tab 4 was the road. The dates the car had been there, the photograph of the plate, the photograph of the driver's face. And tab 5 was the part that frightened her most because tab 5 was Rhea. She built it cold. She made herself do it the way she would have done it for a stranger, and it was the hardest 4 hours of her adult life. And twice she had to get up and walk around the kitchen and put her hands on the counter and breathe, because it was all there. The date she had told Rhea, the date Rhea stopped answering, the date Rhea left her job at the club on the other side of downtown, which Adeline had from the girl on the door and had written down at the time without knowing why. The night on the mezzanine quoted word for word. The 3 nights the car had been on the road. And underneath it, the thing that turned a coincidence into an entry, her own shift schedule printed on a staff room notice, showing that her hours had changed twice since October, and that on both occasions the car had appeared on the new schedule, not the old one. Whoever had put that car there was getting current information about her shifts. There were 4 people who had it: Fatima, the floor manager, Wendell Pike, and Rhea, who had asked her casually warmly in the diner over coffee, the way a friend asks what night she worked. Adeline wrote that down too with the date. Then she closed the binder and put her forehead on it and sat there for a long time. Rosalind Castellan's house was on the east side, and Adeline went there on a Thursday morning at 10 o'clock on the bus in the only coat she owned that did not have a work name on it. She had rehearsed nothing. That was deliberate. She had learned something from Teddy Vance's face in a coffee shop without ever having seen it. That a rehearsed story is a script, and that the one advantage she had over the woman who had stolen her life was that everything Adeline was about to say was true and could survive being interrupted. A man at the gate asked her name and her business. Adeline Kovac, I'm a licensed customs broker. Or I was. She held up the binder. I have documents showing that somebody is building a federal customs fraud case against Fox Point Terminal using falsified entries, and I can prove who, and I can prove when, and I can prove it was being done 11 months ago. I'd like 15 minutes with Mrs. Castellan. The man looked at her for a long moment. Wait here. She waited 50 minutes. She spent it standing because she did not trust herself to sit down and get up again. And at the end of it, a different man came out and said, she'll give you 10. Rosalind Castellan did not offer her anything and did not smile, and the first thing she said was not hello. Sit down. You have 10 minutes, and I'll be honest with you, young woman. I've had 11 people come to this house in 6 years with something they wanted to sell me, and 9 of them cried. I'm not going to cry, Adeline said, and I'm not selling anything. May I use the table? Something flickered across the old woman's face. Use the table. Adeline opened the binder and turned it around so it faced Rosalind, which was a thing she had done 4,000 times in a job she no longer had, and she started on tab 2, not tab 1, because she had learned that you never open with the evidence. You open with the pattern. There are 6 entry summaries. 3 of them declare a value that doesn't match the commercial invoice attached to the same shipment. Not by a rounding margin, by roughly 2/3. That's the first thing. She turned the page. The second thing is that on page 2 and page 5, the container seal number is identical. Same seal, 2 shipments, 11 days apart. That's physically impossible. A seal is destroyed when a container is opened. It cannot exist twice. Rosalind said nothing. Now here's what matters. Adeline put her finger on the header. Every one of these is filed under Fox Point Terminal as the operator of record. 6 for 6. So somebody is stealing from us. No, ma'am. That's what I want you to understand. Adeline sat back. If somebody were stealing from you, they'd hide it. Under declaring is easy to hide. You keep the numbers boring, you keep the seals clean, and nobody ever pulls the file. Whoever wrote these did the opposite. The mismatches are on the face of the document. A customs officer with 4 minutes in a bad mood finds these. They're meant to be found. Rosalind Castellan's hand, which had been flat on the table, curled slowly into itself. Go on. When a federal indictment lands on a terminal operator, the lease gets pulled. The Port Authority takes emergency control, and the operating rights go out to bid. Adeline held her eyes. Nobody is trying to steal from your family. Somebody is trying to take the pier. There was a silence in that room that went on long enough for Adeline to hear a clock somewhere. Then Rosalind said in a completely different voice, "How long have you been reading paper?" 6 years. I sat the broker exam at 23. And where do you work now? I clean at the Verrazano, nights. Rosalind Castellan looked at her for a long, long moment, and Adeline saw at the exact instant the old woman stopped listening to a story and started reading a document. Because Rosalind had kept the family's books since 1979, and she knew what competent work looked like, and she was looking at 4 hours of it laid out in front of her by a woman in a cheap coat. That was what convinced her, not tears, not desperation, the quality of the work. You have more than 10 minutes, Rosalind said. Start again from the beginning. So, it took 2 hours. Adeline walked her through all 5 tabs, and when she got to tab 3, the termination, the appeals, the license, Rosalind stopped her twice to ask questions that no ordinary person would have known to ask. About who had signed the complaint, about whether the query she'd submitted had been logged in a system or sent by email, about whether Adeline had kept her own copy. I kept everything, Adeline said. I keep a daybook every day for 6 years. Show me. Adeline hesitated for the first time. Then she took it out of her bag and put it on the table and said, "There are things in here about my private life. I'd ask you to only read what's relevant." Rosalind took it and opened it at random and read for perhaps 90 seconds, and Adeline watched an old woman's face do something complicated. You wrote down what a man said to you in a locker room at 3:40 in the morning. Yes. Word for word, I said. Yes, ma'am. Why? Because 11 months ago, a room full of people decided I was a liar, Adeline said, and I had nothing, so now I have everything. Rosalind closed the book and handed it back. Then she said, "Tell me about the car." And Adeline told her flatly about 4 nights on an unlit road and about the decision to walk a longer route past a bank camera, and Rosalind listened without moving, and when it was finished, she said, "You did that at 11 weeks pregnant." Adeline went completely still. She had not said it. She had not mentioned it once in 2 hours. It was in tab 5 only as a date on a pharmacy receipt she had included to establish a timeline buried among 9 other receipts. I read your receipts, Rosalind said. You included them to date stamp your movements. That was good work. It also told me something you didn't intend. Adeline put both hands in her lap. Yes, ma'am. How far? Almost 4 months. And the father. And here it was. Adeline had known it was coming since she got on the bus, and she had decided in advance exactly what she would say, and had written it in the book so she could not change it later. I don't know his name, she said. I've never known his name. I took shelter in a room on a night when a man was following me, and there was a stranger in it who'd been drugged out of his mind, and neither of us was in any condition to make a decision, and I left in the morning without taking a single thing that belonged to him. She lifted her chin. I'm not here about that. I'm not asking anybody for anything. I came here because 6 pages fell out of a banquette, and I'm the only person in this state who can read them, and because a car sat on a road for 4 nights waiting for me. Rosalind Castellan had gone the color of paper. Say that again. I'm not asking for anything. The night. Rosalind's voice had dropped so low it barely carried. What night was it? The date, Adeline told her. And Rosalind Castellan put her hand over her mouth, an old woman in her own house, with her hand over her mouth like a girl, and said through it, "Oh my God." Emile arrived 40 minutes later. He came in fast and stopped dead 4 feet inside the room, and Adeline stood up because she did not know what else to do, and the two of them looked at each other. She knew him. She had seen him on a mezzanine, and something in her chest had come apart, and she had never been able to explain it. And Emile Castellan stood there and watched 11 weeks of fog burn off in about 2 seconds, the woman with her back against the door holding something against her chest with both arms looking at him like it had not occurred to her that he was anybody. Nobody spoke. Rosalind broke it because Rosalind always broke it. "Emile, this is Adeline Kovacs. She's a licensed customs broker, and she has just spent 2 hours proving to me that Bertrand Halvard has been manufacturing a federal case against our terminal for 11 months. A pause. "And she was in that hotel room." Adeline turned her head. "What? Sit down, both of you." No, Adeline was still standing, and her voice had gone strange. "No, I'm sorry. What did you just say?" And Emile Castellan, who had not been at a loss for words in 20 years, said the only thing he could get out. "It was me in the room. It was me." Adeline sat down, not gracefully. Her legs simply stopped participating. She sat there and looked at the floor and did the arithmetic, and every piece of it landed at once. The mezzanine, the job Wendell Pike had put her in, 11 weeks of walking past the office of a man who owned the building. The fact that the 6 pages in her binder were an attack on the father of the child inside her. "I didn't know," she said. "I want that written down somewhere. I didn't know. I came here about the paperwork. I came here because of the paperwork." "I know," Rosalind said. "You don't. You think I—" Adeline's voice cracked, and she stopped and got it back. And when she spoke again, it was almost steady. "11 months ago, I got called a liar by people who had every reason to lie. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being a woman who turned up at a rich family's house pregnant. So I wanted on the record that I brought documents. I didn't bring a claim." "Ms. Kovacs?" Emile's voice was rough. "Nobody in this room thinks you brought a claim." "You should," she said, "because somebody did." And the room went absolutely silent. They brought her the tag first. Rosalind sent for it and put it on the table between them, a worn piece of brass with a 5-digit number stamped in it, and Emile said, "Have you ever seen this?" Adeline picked it up. She turned it over. She looked at the number and the wear pattern, and she said, "No, I've never seen it in my life." "What is it?" "A longshoreman's tag issued at Fox Point in 1961. Emile's jaw was tight. "It was around my neck that night. It was gone in the morning. It's the only thing that went missing from that room." Adeline set it down carefully. "Then somebody took it after I left," she said, "because I didn't touch anything. I want you to hear me say it once, and then I'm not going to defend myself again. I stood in front of your nightstand for 11 seconds, and I counted them, and I stepped back, and I said out loud that I wasn't going to touch anything of yours. I wrote it down that morning on the stairs in my building. Before any of this, it's in the book. Tab 5, the entry dated the 15th. Rosalind was already turning pages. She found it. She read it. Adeline watched an old woman's eyes move down a page of small, stitched handwriting, written at 6 in the morning 11 weeks earlier, by a woman who had no idea any of this was coming. "It's here," Rosalind said quietly. "Time she left, room number, floor, the carpet. What she took, which she's written as nothing." She looked up at her son. "Emile," she wrote down the door number. So did the woman who came to Teddy. The woman who came to Teddy told him a story. This one wrote it down 11 weeks before anybody asked her a question. Rosalind's voice sharpened. "There is a difference, and you know exactly what it is." Adeline looked between them. "What woman?" Nobody answered her. "What woman?" she said again. And Emile Castellan said very carefully, "About 11 days after that night, a woman contacted us. She said she was the one in that room. She described it accurately. She had my father's tag, and she said she was pregnant." Adeline did not move. "What's her name?" "Ms. Kovacs." "What is her name?" There was a pause that lasted about 2 seconds and cost Adeline Kovacs 20 years. "Ria Dolan," Emile said. She did not scream. She did not cry. She sat in a chair in a house on the east side and put both hands flat on the table and held perfectly still. And Rosalind Castellan, who had buried a husband and a son and had watched a great many people receive the worst news of their lives, would say afterward that it was the most frightening thing she had ever watched a person do. "Miss Kovac, I need a minute. Take it." Adeline took about 40 seconds. Then she reached over, pulled the binder toward her, and opened it to tab 5 with hands that were not steady. "October 14th, she said. "I met her at a diner on Atwell's and I told her everything. Every detail, the rain, the room, the man on the floor, the fact that he never said his name." Her voice was flat and clear and horrible. "I cried on her. She put her arm around me. And she said, and I wrote it down that night because I wrote everything down. She said, 'You have been carrying that kid and that apartment and that whole hospital on your back alone for 4 years, and you never once asked anybody for anything.'" She turned the page. "October 20th, she stopped answering my phone. November 2nd, I went to her work, and they told me she'd quit 2 weeks earlier. Every one of these is dated. Every one of these I wrote before I had any idea what she'd done." She looked up. "And on the mezzanine, she called me you people in front of 40 men and told me nobody wanted to look at me while they were drinking. I wrote that one down in the stairwell with my hands shaking. You'll see, the writing's wrong on that page." Rosalind found the page. The writing was wrong. "She asked me my schedule," Adeline said, "in the diner, casually, like a friend. And then finally something moved in her face. And there was a car on my road for 4 nights. Emil stood up so fast his chair went over. "Teddy, he's on his way," Rosalind said. "I called him an hour ago. Get the plate to him, now. Sit down." "Mother." "Sit down." Rosalind Castellan did not raise her voice, and the room obeyed anyway. "You are about to go and do something loud, and if you do it loud, this woman loses everything. Think. Think like a bookkeeper for once in your life." She tapped the binder. "What she has here is worth more than that girl's confession. That girl can be made to say anything. This is a record. You do not burn a record to satisfy your temper." Emil stood there, breathing. Then he picked up the chair and sat down.
Disaster.
Teddy Vance arrived at 4, and Adeline recognized him within 4 seconds, and it was not from the club. "You were on the service road," she said. Teddy stopped. "What?" "The night this started. Somebody followed me off the terminal and used my name." She was looking at him very steadily. "That wasn't you. Your voice is wrong. But you came to the bar in Allen's 4 days later and left a number, and my coworker told me a man in a good coat was asking about women who'd been near the hotel district. I wrote it down. I didn't know what it meant." Teddy Vance looked at Rosalind and then at Emil and then at the woman in the cheap coat. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been trying to find you for 4 months. You were about 80 feet from me for 11 weeks. "Yeah." Something in his face closed. "I know." He put a folder on the table. "The plate you photographed belongs to a Cyrus Bell. He's a driver. He does exactly one kind of work, and it isn't driving." He hesitated. "And I put someone on Rhea Dolan 6 days after she came to me because I never believed her. 2 weeks ago, she withdrew $6,000 in cash. It was every dollar in her account." Adeline closed her eyes. "Ms. Kovac," Teddy said, and his voice had changed. "I want to say something and then I'll stop. I've done this 11 years. I have never once taken a statement that fit as well as hers did, and I told him so, and I still didn't find you." He paused. "You found you. Rhea Dolan came to the house on Friday because she was summoned, and she walked into a room with 4 people in it and understood inside 2 seconds that she was finished. Adeline was sitting at the table. Rhea stopped in the doorway, and what happened to her face was not calculation. Adeline watched it and would think about it for years that Rhea did not look at Emil first, or at Rosalind, or at the binder. She looked at Adeline, and for about 1 second she was 7 years old. Then it was gone. "Emil, sit down, Ms. Dolan. You're going to want to hear me before you listen to whatever she's—" "Sit down." She sat. Rosalind Castellan opened the binder and did not look at her. "You told my son's man that you were in a hotel room on the 12th of October. Ms. Kovac's employer has a card log for the staff door of the Verrazano, and your former employer has a shift roster. On the night in question, you clocked out of a door job on Empire Street at 2:40 in the morning, which is 3 hours after Ms. Kovac entered that hotel and 40 minutes after my son stopped being conscious." She turned a page. "You have also stated that you are approximately 2 months pregnant, and that statement is now 4 months old, which would put you at 6 months. Stand up." Rhea did not stand up. "That's what I thought," Rosalind said. Where did you get the tag? Emil's voice was very quiet. Where did you get my father's tag? And Rhea Dolan looked at the table and said, Wendell Pike, he owed me $19,000. He gave it to me as collateral. He said it was antique. Adeline made a small sound, because there it was, the last piece dropping into the ledger. Pike had found it. Pike had put her in the building. Pike had signed the declarations. He didn't know what it was, Rhea said. Neither did I. It was in my drawer for 6 days. It was worth $11 to me. It was in a drawer. And then Adeline told you about the room, Rosalind said. Rhea said nothing. And then you knew what it was. Rhea said nothing, and Adeline stood up. Look at me. Rhea did not. Rhea, She looked. Did you send that car? And the whole room went still, and Rhea Dolan's face broke open, and what came out of her was not remorse, and it was not denial. It was 20 years of something she had never once said out loud. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch you? Her voice went up and cracked. You did everything right, every single thing your whole life. You studied, you passed the exam, you kept your head down. You never took a dollar that wasn't yours, and they took your license anyway. And you ended up on your knees cleaning a floor at 3 in the morning. So what was it for, Addie? What was any of it for? That doesn't answer, Mike. They put a plastic marker on my mother's grave. Rhea was crying now, and it was real, and that was the unbearable part. $900 for a stone. I've been 22 years old my whole life because of $900. And then you handed me a way out, and you were never going to use it. You were never going to walk into that man's world. Girls like us clean it, so it was going to sit there and rot, and nobody was ever going to have it. And I took it. Yes, I took it. Did you send the car? And Rhea Dolan looked at her oldest friend and said, you were the only person alive who could put me back. Adeline did not move for a long moment. Then she said quietly, you could have asked me for the $900. Rhea stopped breathing. I didn't have it, Adeline said. You know I didn't have it. I'd have found it. I'd have worked 6 more shifts and I'd have found it, and you never once asked because you decided a long time ago that asking made you the person we used to be. Her voice finally broke. You didn't have to take my life, Rhea. You could have just asked me for the headstone. Jam. The police were called at 6 that evening, and that was Adeline's doing, and it was the hardest fight of the day. Emil wanted it handled. He did not say the word. He did not have to. Teddy went very quiet, and Rosalind looked at the wall, and Adeline understood exactly what was being decided in front of her. She stood up. No. Ms. Kovach? No, listen to me. She put her hand flat on the binder. If this gets handled your way, then none of this exists. There's no arrest, there's no case, there's no record. Pike keeps signing declarations. Halvard keeps building. And my termination file still says I'm a liar forever because the only thing that could ever overturn it is a federal proceeding where somebody swears the truth under oath. That proceeding will land on my terminal. Yes, Adeline said, it will. The room went cold. You're asking me to hand federal investigators a fraud case with my own name on the header. I'm asking you to let me file a whistleblower complaint on customs fraud, she said. And I'm telling you honestly what that costs you because I'm not going to lie to you to get what I want. They'll audit Fox Point. They'll open every book you have. Everything you've kept off the record for 60 years comes into the light, or it gets found. She held his eyes. I'm not going to pretend that isn't the price. Emil Castellan stared at her. Why would I possibly agree to that? Because you're going to be indicted either way. Her voice did not shake. That's what these 6 pages are for. Halvard's case is already built. The only question left is whether it arrives with you on the wrong end of it or whether you get there first with the person who found it. She paused. You can't outrun this. You can only be the one who reported it. Nobody said anything. Then Rosalind Castellan laughed one short, astonished sound. Emil, she said, she's right, and she's right in a way that cost her something to say, and I have not heard that in this house in 40 years. She turned to Adeline. Do it. Mother. She's right. The old woman's hand came down flat on the table. I have kept these books since 1979, and I have known every day of it what would happen if somebody ever looked. Well, somebody's looking. I'd rather it be her. They took Rhea Dolan out at 11 that night on charges of grand larceny fraud and criminal solicitation, and Adeline stood in the hallway and watched. She did not say goodbye. She did not say anything at all. But at the door, Rhea turned around, and for the second time that day, she was 7 years old, and she said the only true thing she had said in 4 months. Addie, I'm sorry about Josie. And Adeline Kovac, who had been holding herself together for 11 hours, put her hand over her mouth and turned away. It was almost midnight when Emil found her sitting on the front steps. He sat down beside her, which was not a thing he did, and neither of them spoke for a while. Your sister, he said finally. The surgery. Don't. I can have her in the best cardiac unit on the East Coast by Monday morning. Don't. Adeline turned on him, and her voice cracked open. Do you understand what happens to me if you pay for that for the rest of my life? In every room I ever walk into, I'm the woman who got paid. That's what the file says about me now that I take things. And I have spent 11 months in everything I own proving that I don't. Emil sat with that. So what do I do, he said, because she's 12 and she's dying, and I'm sitting here. Adeline pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes. There's a reward, she said, on customs fraud recoveries. It's statutory. If a complaint results in a recovery, the person who filed it gets a percentage. Her voice was shaking. It could be a lot, but it takes months and she has weeks, and I've done the math about 400 times and it doesn't work, and I don't know what I'm going to do. Emil Castellan looked out at nothing for a long moment. Then let me lend it to you, he said. Not give, lend at interest, on paper notarized with a schedule against the reward. He turned his head. You'd owe me. You'd hate owing me. Every payment would be recorded, and when it was done, it would be done, and nobody in any room for the rest of your life could say you took anything. Adeline stared at him. You'd do that. You want it on the record, what he said. Fine, put it on the record. And Adeline Kovac, who had counted 11 seconds in front of a nightstand and stepped back, sat on the steps of a house on the east side and cried for the first time in front of him. Then she wiped her face and took the day book out of her bag and opened it to a clean page. Okay, she said, then we're going to write the terms down, right now, both of us, before either of us can change what we meant. They wrote the terms on the steps that night, both of them in the daybook, and Emil Castellan signed his name under hers at 12:41 in the morning with a pen she handed him. The formal note was drawn up by a lawyer 4 days later, and it was 11 pages long, and Adeline read every one of them, and she made 3 changes. She struck a clause that would have forgiven the balance in the event of her death because she did not want anybody ever able to say the debt had been decorative. She added a schedule of payments beginning 90 days after disbursement, whether or not any reward ever came. And she added a line in her own handwriting in the margin initialed by both of them. No party to this agreement has any claim upon the personal circumstances of the other. The lawyer looked at that line for a long moment and then at her. Ms. Kovac, you understand this doesn't have any legal effect. I know what it does, Adeline said. It goes in the file. Emil initialed it without a word. Josie Kovac went into surgery on a Tuesday at 6:40 in the morning. Adeline signed the consent forms with a hand that would not stay still, and then sat in a waiting room for 9 hours and 11 minutes and did not eat anything and did not speak to anybody. At the 4th hour, a nurse came out and said they were progressing, which meant nothing. At the 7th hour, nobody came out at all, and Adeline stood up and walked the corridor twice and made herself sit back down and put both hands on her stomach. She was almost 5 months by then and starting to show in a way that clothes could not fix, and said out loud quietly, she's going to be fine. She's going to be fine, and you're going to meet her. At the 9th hour, the surgeon came out with his mask pulled down, and Adeline was on her feet before he had cleared the door. She did beautifully. Adeline did not hear anything after that for a few seconds. The valve is in the repair, is clean. She came off bypass without any trouble. She's going to be sore, and she's going to be tired, and she's going to complain a great deal, and in 6 weeks, she's going to be able to climb a flight of stairs. He paused. Ms. Kovac, I want to say something. She was very close. I don't say that to frighten you now that it's over. I say it because you got her here. Adeline sat down on the floor. Right there in the corridor, in front of a surgeon and 2 nurses and a man mopping the tiles, she sat down on the floor with her back against the wall and sobbed into both hands like a child, and nobody told her to get up. Josie woke up 9 hours later, and the first thing she said in a voice like sandpaper was, "Did you sleep?" "No." "You're the worst." And Adeline laughed and cried at the same time and put her forehead down on the edge of the bed. Josie's hand came up and found her hair. Addie, a pause. Your stomach's different. Yeah. Is it a baby or did you finally start eating? It's a baby. Josie thought about that for a long moment. Okay, she said. Am I an aunt or a sister? Because I want to be a sister, but I'll take aunt. Adeline made a sound that was not entirely a laugh. You'll be whatever you want. Aunt sounds old. Josie's eyes were closing again. I'll be a sister. Tell them I said so. The complaint was filed 11 days later. Adeline Kovach walked into a federal building in downtown Providence with a binder and a copy of it and a second copy in a bank box across town, and she sat across from two investigators for 4 hours and 40 minutes. And she did not once say the word mafia, and she did not once mention a hotel room, and she never had to. She talked about seal numbers. She talked about declared value against commercial invoice. She talked about the 11-month gap between her internal query and the complaint that ended her career, and she walked them through the disciplinary file line by line. And at the end of it, one of the investigators, a woman about 50, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, sat back and said, Ms. Kovach, who taught you to build a file like this? Nobody. I just never trusted anybody to remember things for me. The woman looked at her for a moment. How long were you out of work? 14 months now. Right, she made a note. That's going in too. It moved faster than Adeline had expected, and it moved because of something she had not planned. Wendell Pike broke in 19 days. He broke because he was a man who had never in his life been the most frightened person in a room and suddenly was, and because federal investigators had walked in with a schedule of entries he had personally signed and a photograph of a brass tag he had pawned to a door girl in Cranston. He gave them Bertrand Halvard's operations director in the first interview, and Halvard himself in the third, and he cried while he did it, which the investigators later described in a way that Adeline would read in a transcript and feel absolutely nothing about. What she did feel something about was one line in his statement. Asked why the Kovach complaint had been filed against a broker with a clean 6-year record, Wendell Pike said, because she read the paperwork. Nobody reads the paperwork. She was the only one who read it. Adeline read that sentence in a photocopied transcript in her kitchen at 2 in the morning and put her hand over her mouth. 14 months of believing in the deepest and most private part of herself that maybe she really had been careless, that maybe she was just a strange, difficult woman who counted things. She had been destroyed for doing her job correctly. She put the page down and cried for about 4 minutes, and then she picked the page back up and filed it in tab 3, where it belonged. Bertrand Halvard was indicted on a Thursday in March on 11 counts. He was 55 years old and had given a speech at a Chamber of Commerce dinner 4 months earlier about modernizing the waterfront, and he surrendered at 9 in the morning in a suit and was released the same afternoon, and his attorney gave a statement about looking forward to a full vindication. He did not get one. 2 of his own executives had already gone in. The seal number duplications were not arguable. They were physically impossible. And no jury in the country needs a customs expert to understand that the same padlock cannot be on 2 doors at once. He took a plea 14 months later. 51 months in forfeiture and a permanent bar from the federal contracting. But that was later. What happened first was the part Adeline had promised would happen, and she had not lied about it, and it landed exactly as hard as she said it would. Fox Point Terminal went under federal monitoring on the 2nd of April. That meant a court-appointed monitor with an office inside the building. It meant every book, every ledger, every lease, every subcontract, every cash handling procedure the Castellan family had used since 1979, opened up and read by strangers with subpoena power. It cost them in the first year a little more than half of what they made. Because about half of what the Castellans made had never touched a ledger, and it could not survive being looked at, and it simply stopped the arrangements at the gate, the trucking outfits that paid in the wrong direction, the 6 decades of things that had been possible, because nobody with a badge had ever had a reason to sit in that building for 300 days a year. Teddy Vance told Adeline the number over coffee once months in, not accusingly, just because she asked. She sat with it. I said it would cost you, she said. You did, to his face, before he agreed. Teddy turned his cup around. Mr. Kovach, I've watched 11 people make him a promise. You're the only one who told him the bad half first. Rosalind Castellan sat for 4 days of testimony in June. She was 67 years old and she answered every question, and she did not once take the fifth, which her lawyer had advised her to do 11 times. On the last afternoon, she came out and found Adeline in the corridor, 6 months pregnant by then and there because she had been called in for the same proceeding, and the old woman sat down beside her heavily and said nothing for a while. Then she said, 40 years I kept those books. Do you know what I felt in there? No, ma'am. Relief. Rosalind laughed a dry, astonished sound. 40 years I was the only person alive who knew where all of it was. Every night, every single night, thinking if I have a stroke, it all disappears with me. She shook her head. You took it out of my hands. You have no idea what you did. Adeline looked at her. I'm sorry it cost you so much. Don't! Rosalind's voice went sharp for a second, the old voice. Don't apologize for the price of an honest entry. That's the one thing I will not have in my house. Well, I mean, it cost Adeline too, and it cost her in the ways she had known it would, and in 3 ways she had not. The first was her privacy. Her name went into a federal filing and out into the newspapers, and the Journal ran a piece with the words former customs broker in the headline and a photograph of her walking out of the courthouse, visibly pregnant, which she had not consented to and could do nothing about. 2 of the online write-ups did not bother with the customs part at all. One used the phrase, the cleaner and the crime boss. She read that one once at 4 in the morning and then made herself stop reading them. The second was that she had to say it out loud, under oath in a deposition in front of 11 strangers, because Halvard's defense wanted to establish bias, wanted to establish that the woman who found the pages had a personal relationship with the target of the frame. She had to sit in a chair and describe the night of the 12th of October in a room with a court reporter typing every word. She did it in 4 sentences. She had rehearsed it in the daybook 40 times. I was followed off the terminal grounds by a man who used my name. I entered a hotel and took shelter in an unlocked room on the 4th floor. There was a man in that room who had been drugged and was not capable of standing. I left at approximately 5:40 in the morning, and I took nothing. The attorney asked her whether she had known who he was. No. He asked her when she had learned. 4 months later, in his mother's house, 20 minutes after I finished explaining the seal numbers, he asked her in a tone she would remember for a long time whether she expected anyone to believe that. And Adeline Kovach said, I don't need you to believe me. I wrote it down that morning. It's Exhibit 14. The third cost was the threats. 3 letters and 1 phone call over 4 months. The letter she photographed and turned in. The phone call came at 11 at night on her own number, which nobody outside the case had. And a man's voice said her sister's name and the name of the hospital. She hung up. She sat on the kitchen floor for 10 minutes. Then she got up and wrote down the time, the duration, the exact words, and the fact that her hands were shaking as she wrote it, because she had promised herself years ago that she would never soften a record to make herself feel better. She turned it in the next morning. A federal marshal sat outside Josie's room for 6 weeks. Nothing happened after that. She never found out whether it was the marshal or something else, and she made a decision not to ask Emil Castellan, and she never did. Rhea Dolan pleaded guilty in September. She took it rather than go to trial, and her attorney's argument at sentencing was that the solicitation had been withdrawn, that Cyrus Bell had walked away and no harm had come to anyone. And the prosecutor's answer was that no harm had come to anyone because the intended victim had photographed a license plate at 3 in the morning while pregnant, which was not mitigation, it was somebody else's competence. She got 7 years. Adeline went to the sentencing. Nobody asked her to. She did not give a victim statement. The prosecutor had offered, and she had declined twice and could not entirely explain why. Even in the daybook, she sat in the 3rd row. Rhea saw her when they brought her in and looked away immediately and then looked back, and the 2 of them looked at each other across a courtroom for perhaps 4 seconds. And afterward in the corridor, Rhea's attorney came and found her. Ms. Kovach, she asked me to give you something. I've read it, it's not anything improper. It was a piece of paper folded in half, and on it, in Rhea Dolan's handwriting, was one line. You were right, I could have just asked. Adeline stood in a courthouse corridor and read it about 9 times. Then she folded it and put it in her bag, and she did not put it in the daybook, and she never wrote about it, and that was the only entry she ever deliberately left out of 14 years of records. She did one more thing. She waited until spring, until after the baby, and she went out to the cemetery in Cranston on a Saturday morning with a receipt in her coat pocket. It had taken her 4 months to find the plot because Rhea had never told her where it was, and she had had to go through the funeral home and then the cemetery office, and then a woman in a records room who had been genuinely kind about it. The plastic marker was still there. 5 years of weather had taken most of the letters off. The stone she had ordered went in 3 weeks later. Granite plain, the name and the 2 dates in one line underneath that, Adeline had thought about for a long time and had finally chosen, because it was the only thing she actually knew for certain about Marguerite Dolan, which was that her daughter had loved her enough to destroy herself over $900. Her daughter never forgot her. It cost her $1,140, and she paid it in 4 installments out of her own wages, and she never told Rhea, and she never told anyone. She wrote it in the book, though, one line with the date, because that was the whole architecture of the woman. If it happened, it got recorded, and this had happened. The reward came through in November of the following year. It was a statutory percentage of a recovery that ran into 8 figures, and the check that arrived in Adeline Kovach's mailbox was for an amount that she had to read 4 times, sitting on the 3rd step of her own stairwell, in the same spot where she had once written down the words, "I took nothing." She paid Emil Castellan back in full on a Thursday. Not a wire. She went to the house and she brought the note and the schedule and a cashier's check, and she made him sign the satisfaction of debt in front of her, and she took a photograph of it with her phone before he had put the pen down. "You could have mailed it," he said. "No, I couldn't." He looked at the paper in his hand and then at her. 14 months of payments, and you never missed one. Not one, even the month the marshal was outside the hospital. "I know," Adeline said. "That's why I couldn't mail it." Her license came back in March. It took the federal proceeding and Wendell Pike's statement in a review board hearing at which Adeline sat alone at a table with a binder because she still could not bring herself to spend money on a lawyer. And it took 11 minutes of deliberation, which the chairwoman apologized for as though it had been a long time. The revocation was vacated. The termination for cause was expunged. The record was corrected to reflect that the original complaint had been filed in retaliation for a good faith internal query. They read it out loud. That was the part Adeline had not been prepared for. Somebody read into an official record in a room with a stenographer the sentence, "The board finds that Miss Kovach acted correctly." She sat there and did not move. 14 months of unemployment, 6 of night shifts, 2 years in total of being a woman who took things. Corrected in one sentence. Afterward, in the parking lot, she sat in a car. Her own car, the first one she had ever owned, and cried for a long time with both hands on the wheel, and then she took out the daybook and wrote the date in the finding in the 11-minute deliberation. And underneath it, she wrote, "It took 2 years, and it fit on one line." The Port Authority offered her a job in June, document compliance officer for the Providence and Fox Point facilities, reviewing entries, auditing declarations, flagging discrepancies, which meant in practical terms that Adeline Kovach spent her working week reading the paperwork of Fox Point Terminal, Emil's terminal. She sat with the offer for 2 days, and then she took it, and the first thing she did was walk into Rosalind Castellan's house on a Sunday and tell both of them to their faces, "I want it said out loud in front of you once, and then we never discuss it again." She was standing. She had refused a chair. "I'm going to be reviewing your filings. If I ever find something in your paperwork, I will write it up exactly the way I would write up anybody else's, and I will not warn you, and I will not come to this house first. If that's a problem, I need to know now because I'll take a different job." Emil looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you know what my father would have called you?" "No." "A pain in the ass." He almost smiled. "He'd have hired you in about 4 minutes." Rosalind Castellan set her cup down. "Take the job," she said. "And Ms. Kovach, when you write us up, and you will, because everybody's paper is wrong. Somewhere put my name on it, not his. I kept those books. It's mine." She wrote them up 11 months later over a misdeclared classification code on a container of industrial fittings. It was minor. It was a fine. She filed it exactly the way she said she would. Rosalind Castellan framed the notice and hung it in the office at the terminal. And when people asked which they did, she said, "That's my daughter-in-law. She's very good at her job." He asked her in October, 2 years to the month, from a rainy night neither of them had chosen. He did it badly, which she liked. Emil Castellan, who had negotiated with longshoremen's unions and federal monitors, and men who had wanted him dead, sat on a bench outside a hospital where their son had been born 4 months earlier and could not get through 2 consecutive sentences. She let him struggle for a while. Then she said, "Emil, ask the question." He asked it. And Adeline Kovach, who had been asked for many things in her life and had almost never been asked for anything, said yes and then held up one hand. 3 terms. Of course there are 3 terms. I keep my name. Kovach goes on my son's birth certificate next to yours, and it stays there. She counted them off. I keep my job. If that ever becomes inconvenient for your family, it's your family that adjusts, not my job. And the third, Adeline was quiet for a moment. Our children grow up knowing exactly where the money in this family comes from. All of it. The clean part and what the clean part is built on top of. She met his eyes. I'm not raising a boy who thinks his family was always respectable. I'm raising a boy who knows what it costs to become it. Because the day anybody in this family decides the record should be softened, we're finished, and I mean it, and I want that one written down too. Emil Castellan looked at the woman he was going to marry. You want to write our wedding terms in the daybook? Yes. You understand that's insane. I understand it's the only promise I've ever made that nobody will be able to argue about in 14 years. She was already taking it out of her bag. Sit still. This won't take long. There. She never stopped keeping it. Not when the terminal came out of monitoring in the 4th year, running clean and thinner and legal with a court-appointed compliance office that Adeline had personally designed the filing protocols for. Not when Josie Kovach graduated high school with a scar down her sternum that she showed people on purpose and a plan to study nursing. Not when the second baby came, or the third, or when Rosalind died at 74 with her hand in her son's and her books in perfect order. Not when a young woman came into the Port Authority office one afternoon, 23, a broker's license, 11 weeks old, terrified, holding a printout, and said she thought she had found something wrong in a declaration and that her supervisor had told her to let it go. Adeline Kovach put down her pen and said, "Sit down, show me." And when the girl had finished and was sitting there white-faced and asking what she should do, Adeline reached into her drawer and took out a brand new composition notebook, unopened one of the box of 12 she kept in there and had kept in there for years, and slid it across the desk. You write down what you found. You write down the date, the time, who you told, and exactly what they said back to you in their words. And then you keep doing it every single day, whether anything happens or not, for as long as you have this job. She held the girl's eyes. They will come for you. Not today. Maybe not this year. But the day they decide you're a problem, they will tell a room full of people that you're careless and dishonest, and every single one of them will believe it because they'll have suits on and you'll have a lanyard. So what stops them? Nothing stops them, Adeline said, but a record outlives them. The girl took the notebook, and Adeline Kovach, who had once stood in front of a stranger's nightstand and counted 11 seconds and stepped back, who had been fired, revoked, followed, framed, betrayed by the person who knew her best, hunted on an unlit road and rebuilt entirely out of nothing, but her own handwriting, turned back to the entries on her desk and kept reading, because that was the work, and the work was hers, and no one was ever going to take her name out of her own book again.